Have you ever woken up to the sound of nothing? Not the gentle hum of your fridge, not traffic, not even your annoying neighbour's early morning jazz. Just a profound, unsettling silence. Imagine that, but across an entire continent. Because tonight, we're talking about a time when Europe quite literally fell silent. Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about what happened after the Black Death ended. And trust me, this isn't your typical dry, dusty history lesson. We're diving headfirst into one of the most dramatic, unexpected, and frankly, hilarious, in retrospect, for us, not for them, transformations in human history. We're talking about a time when Europe had to rebuild itself from the ground up, with roughly half its population gone. Picture it. Feudal lords suddenly finding themselves begging for labour, peasants accidentally becoming millionaires, and the entire social order doing a full-on belly flop. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, the slightly gruesome, unexpectedly funny kind of history, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. It helps more people find this little corner of the internet. And I'm super curious where you're all listening from. So drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. It always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. Alright? Find that cozy spot. Take a nice, slow breath and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to 1453, and trust me, you're going to be real grateful for that mattress by the time we're done. So, congratulations. You just woke up in England, specifically the year 1353. That's about 5 years after the Black Death swept through Europe like nothing anyone had ever seen before. The good news, you survived. Give yourself a pat on the back. You beat the bubonic plague, the pneumonic plague, and probably a few other delightful ailments. The bad news, well, let's just say, the world you knew is gone. Poof, vanished. You open your eyes, and the first thing that hits you isn't what you see, it's what you don't hear. No morning bustle from the village square. No children playing in the muddy streets. Because, let's be honest, hygiene was still a distant dream. No rhythmic hammering from the blacksmith shop, nor the distant bleating of sheep being herded to pasture. Just silence. That heavy, unnatural quiet that settles over places where too many people used to live. It's the sound of absence. Your muscles ache as you stretch. That deep tiredness that comes from working harder than your body wants to. But these days, everyone who's left works harder than they should. There's no choice. You roll over, feeling the rough straw mattress beneath you. At least you have a mattress now. Before the plague, serfs like you slept on bare ground, maybe with some old rags for warmth, sharing a hut with half a dozen family members and a particularly ambitious rat. But now, well, when half the population suddenly drops dead, there's a lot more stuff to go around. Strange how that works, isn't it? A massive demographic catastrophe, and suddenly you've upgraded your bedding. Who knew mass death was the fastest way to improve your interior decorating? You sit up slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the one small, grimy window. The house itself is bigger than what you grew up in. It used to belong to the miller and his family. All 6 of them died in the space of a week back in 1348. Their bodies were buried in the churchyard. Along with so many others, they had to dig mass graves. These days, you try not to think about that too much. It's hard to enjoy your newfound spacious living quarters when you keep remembering that the previous tenants expired dramatically in them. The floorboards creak under your feet. Actual wooden floors, not just packed dirt. You inherited more than just a house when the plague finished its grisly work. There's a chest in the corner with clothes that actually fit, not just hand-me-downs from your larger, healthier relatives. A proper cooking pot hangs over the fireplace. Even a pewter cup, which used to be something only wealthy merchants or ridiculously fancy knights could afford. Funny thing about catastrophes, they have a way of redistributing wealth, just not in any way you'd ever want, like through a lottery, or, not dying. You pull on your tunic, wool instead of the rough hemp you wore before. It's a good feeling, warm against your skin, but there's always that little voice in the back of your head, that nagging whisper, reminding you that this tunic used to belong to someone who died choking on their own blood. You try not to think about that either. It's amazing how much mental real estate is taken up by polite avoidance in a post-apocalyptic medieval world. Outside, your breath makes little clouds in the morning air. September in England has always been cold, but somehow it feels colder now. Maybe it's just because there are fewer people to warm the world with their presence. Or maybe, just maybe, when you've seen as much death as everyone has, everything just feels a little colder, a little sharper. The village of Little Wickham looks like a mouth with half its teeth knocked out. Houses stand empty, their doors hanging open like slack jaws. Gardens have grown wild, choked with weeds and thorny brambles. Fences are falling down, their posts rotten and crumbling. In the distance, you can see fields that should be golden with ripening grain, ready for harvest. But instead, they're brown and barren, stretches of untamed wilderness. No one left to harvest them. Before the plague, this village had maybe 200 people. Now, maybe 60 on a good day. It's a ghost town with occasional very tired residents. Your stomach growls, sharp and insistent. That's the thing they don't tell you about surviving disasters. You still get hungry. Life goes on, even when it feels like it shouldn't. The body, bless its stubborn little heart, insists on requiring sustenance. You walk toward the village centre, past the well where people used to gather, gossiping, laughing, exchanging news. The wooden bucket hangs there, rope frayed and water level low. Maintenance is, well, everything's about maintenance now. There just aren't enough hands to keep things running the way they used to. The baker's shop is still closed. Has been for 3 years now. Thomas the baker died, along with his wife and 2 sons. His apprentice, a well-meaning but ultimately misguided youth, tried to keep things going for a while, but bread making isn't something you just pick up. The few loaves he managed to make were, let's just say, dense enough to use as building materials. These days, people bake their own bread, or at least they try to. Turns out, a lot of knowledge died with the plague. All those little skills that people pass down from parent to child. Gone. Just gone. The delicate art of not making bread into a brick. Lost. You can smell wood smoke drifting from the direction of the manor house, Lord Edmund's place. He survived, though just barely. Lost his wife, his 3 children, most of his household staff. Now it's just him, his remaining steward, and maybe a dozen servants, where there used to be 50. Poor bastard. He actually has to do some of his own work now. Can you imagine? A lord, working, the indignity. But here's where things get interesting. And this is the part that would have been utterly unthinkable before the plague. You're not going to bow and scrape when you see him. You're not going to tug your forelock and mumble, "Yes, my lord," and "No, my lord," like your father did. Because Lord Edmund needs you more than you need him. See, when half the population suddenly vanishes, the people who are left become very, very valuable. It's supply and demand, medieval style, and for the first time in centuries, you're the supply, and he's the desperate demand. You're essentially a living, breathing, incredibly scarce resource. Your feet crunch on the frost-covered grass as you make your way toward the manor. Today's the day. You're going to ask for more money. 3 months ago, you would have been whipped for even thinking such a thing. But 3 months ago, Lord Edmund had other options. He doesn't anymore. The manor house looms ahead. Stone walls that used to seem so imposing, so powerful. Now, they just look like expensive walls around an increasingly empty house. Most of the windows are shuttered. No point heating rooms nobody uses. It's a monument to a way of life that's rapidly decaying. You rap on the heavy wooden door. 3 sharp knocks that echo in the morning stillness. Footsteps approach, slow and measured. The steward opens the door. Richard, a man who used to have 3 assistants. Now he does everything himself. He looks like he's been running on fumes for years. "Morning, Thomas," he says, his voice carrying that particular weariness that everyone has now. The exhaustion of people trying to do too much with too little. "Morning, Richard. Need to speak with his lordship." Richard raises an eyebrow. Before the plague, peasants didn't just demand audiences with lords. They waited, they pleaded, they got trampled by horses. But these aren't before the plague times. "He's in the solar. I'll let him know you're here." He sounds hesitant, like he's unsure of the new rules of engagement. Because frankly, so is everyone else. You wait in the great hall. Even here, you can see how much has changed. The tapestries are dusty, hung crookedly. There's no one left to maintain them properly. The long tables, where dozens of people used to eat, are mostly pushed against the walls and covered with cloths, like forgotten ghosts of feasts past. Lord Edmund appears at the top of the stairs. He's smaller than you remember, thinner. The plague didn't kill him, but it aged him 20 years in 5. His fine clothes hang loose on his frame. Even the rich don't eat as well as they used to. Calories are calories, whether you're a lord or a lowly peasant. "Thomas," he says, coming down the stairs with careful dignity. "Richard says you wanted to speak with me?" "Aye, my lord, about my wages." The words hang in the air between you. A year ago, hell, 6 months ago, this conversation would have ended with you in the stocks, publicly humiliated, probably with a few missing teeth. But Lord Edmund just sighs, like a man who's had this conversation too many times already. He looks less like a powerful feudal lord, and more like a harried manager trying to balance his books. "What are you making now? 2 shillings a week, is it?" "Aye, but John over in Great Wickham, he's getting 3 shillings for the same work, and they're throwing in an extra measure of grain. You know this for a fact. You checked. You're not just some random peasant. You're a peasant with market intelligence." Lord Edmund's jaw tightens. John's always been... He stops himself, takes a breath. "What exactly are you asking for, Thomas?" 3 shillings, and I want Sundays off, proper off, not just morning service and then back to work, same as any free man. the old Lord Edmund would have exploded, called the guards, had you beaten to within an inch of your life. But the old Lord Edmund had 50 workers to choose from. This Lord Edmund has you, and maybe 5 others, if he's lucky. He looks out of the window at his fields, brown stubble where golden grain should be waving. Fields that need to be ploughed for winter wheat. Work that has to be done, and not enough people to do it. 2 shillings and 6pence, he says finally, his voice tight with reluctant surrender. And Sunday afternoons off. You pretend to consider this, though honestly, it's more than you hoped for. But you've learned something important in these past few years. When someone needs you more than you need them, you have power, and a ½ shilling more is a ½ shilling more. Done, you say, extending your hand. He shakes it, a lord shaking hands with a peasant. Your grandfather would have fainted dead away. The very fabric of society is unravelling, one handshake at a time. As you walk back through the village, you pass the churchyard. The original cemetery was full by the time the plague finished its work, so they dug new sections. Then those filled up too. Now there are graves scattered around the church like fallen leaves, a constant, silent reminder of what was lost. But life, somehow, keeps going. You see Margaret hanging laundry behind her cottage. She's wearing a dress that's too fine for a widow, but her husband had been the village's most successful merchant before he died. Now she owns his business, such as it is. Women inheriting property, running their own shops. Another thing that would have been impossible before. Strange how catastrophe creates opportunities. She waves at you, and you wave back. Maybe later, when the work's done, you'll stop by, share some ale, talk about how things used to be, and maybe, if you're both in the right mood, you'll talk about how things might be. Because that's the thing nobody tells you about surviving disasters. Eventually, you start thinking about the future again. Your stomach rumbles once more, reminding you that survival still requires the basics: food, shelter, work. But as you head toward your own fields, the ones you're renting now, that you can actually afford, you're thinking about more than just getting by. You're thinking about getting ahead. The walk to your fields takes you past the old grain mill. The wheel still turns, but slowly. There's not enough grain to keep it busy. Before the plague, this mill ran from dawn to dusk during harvest season. Now, maybe 2 or 3 hours a day. But that's changing too, slowly. Because the people who survived, they're eating better, working less, demanding more. And when people have more money in their pockets, they buy more grain, more meat, more of everything. It's like watching a broken machine slowly start to work again, but differently, better in some ways. It's the sound of a very strange economic boom. Your fields stretch out before you. Not huge, no, but yours. Well, rented, but at terms that your father never could have imagined. Lord Edmund was so desperate for someone to work this land that he agreed to let you keep 60% of what you grow. Before the plague, a peasant might keep 20% if he was lucky. And that was after a long negotiation, probably involving grovelling. The soil is dark and rich, ready for winter planting. You run it through your fingers, feeling the potential there. This land could feed a family, with enough left over to sell at market. Maybe even enough to buy that small piece of property down by the river that's been sitting empty since the Hartwell family tragically died. Because here's what nobody expected. When the plague finished killing people, it left behind a world with abundant land and scarce workers. And for the first time in centuries, that meant ordinary people had choices. Real choices. You spend the morning breaking ground for winter wheat, the wooden plough cutting clean furrows in the earth. It's good work, honest work, but it's also chosen work. You're here because you want to be, not because some lord commanded it. That, my friends, makes all the difference. Around midday, you stop for bread and ale. The bread's your own, made from grain you grew yourself. It's dense, a little burned on one side, but it's yours, and that makes it taste better than any bread some baker ever made. As you eat, you watch smoke rising from chimneys around the village. Fewer chimneys than before, but the ones that are lit burn brighter. People heat their homes better now, eat heartier meals, wear warmer clothes. The plague took everything, but it also left everything behind for the survivors. A macabre inheritance, but an inheritance nonetheless. You finish your meal and get back to work. The afternoon sun is warm on your shoulders as you guide the plough through another furrow. In the distance, you can hear Margaret's children playing. They're some of the few children left in the village, and their laughter carries farther now that there's less noise to compete with it. It's a lonely sound, yes, but not entirely sad, because those children, they're growing up in a world where a peasant can negotiate with a lord, where a widow can run a business, where someone born in a one-room hovel can end up farming their own fields. That's worth something, isn't it? That's everything. As the sun starts to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, you clean your tools and head home. Home to a house that's bigger than where you grew up. Home to a supper that'll be better than what your parents ever ate. Home to a life that, yes, born from tragedy, is undeniably better than what came before. Tomorrow, you'll plant more wheat. Next week, you'll probably have another frank conversation with Lord Edmund about wages or working conditions. Next month, maybe you'll make an offer on that property by the river. Because the world ended, and then it began again. Different, smaller in some ways, but somehow, miraculously, bigger in others. And as you settle into bed, pulling warm wool blankets up to your chin, you think about your children, the ones you might have someday. They'll grow up in a world where people like you, people who work with their hands and sweat for their bread, actually have a say in how things go. That's not nothing. That's everything, really. Your eyes grow heavy as the village settles into its quiet evening rhythm. Fewer voices than there used to be, but somehow the ones that remain carry more weight. The Black Death took everything, but what it left behind? What it left behind was possibility, a terrifying, brutal, but undeniable possibility. Word spreads fast in small villages, especially when it's bad news for the people in charge. By autumn, 3 other peasants in Little Wickham have demanded raises and gotten them. Margaret's hired 2 of her neighbours to help with the merchant business, paying them wages that would have seemed impossible just a few years back. The whole village is buzzing with this new, intoxicating sense of agency. But here's where things get complicated, and here's where our story takes a turn from hopeful new beginnings to simmering rebellion. King Edward's court down in London has been hearing stories. Rumours, whispers, then outright complaints. Stories about peasants getting uppity. Stories about lords paying outrageous wages. Stories about the natural order of things getting turned upside down. And the king, well, he's not happy. Not one bit. His royal brow is furrowed. His crown is probably a little crooked with indignation. You hear about it first from a travelling tinker who stops by the village in late October. His cart is loaded with pots and pans, gleaming copper and dull iron. But more importantly, he's loaded with news from the wider world. Unfiltered gossip from tavern to tavern. Parliament's passed a new law, he tells you, his voice low and conspiratorial, as you examine a copper pot. The Statute of Labourers, they're calling it, says no worker can demand more than they were paid back in 1346, before all the dying started. You set the pot down, feeling something cold settle in your stomach. What's that mean exactly? The tinker glances around, making sure no one's listening. Means if they catch you asking for higher wages, they can put you in the stocks, brand your face. Some places, they're hanging folks. The copper pot suddenly feels very heavy in your hands. Of course, the powerful don't just sit back and watch their world change. They legislate, they punish, they try to roll back the clock. Of course, the tinker continues, lowering his voice even further. Law's one thing, enforcement's another. Hard to punish a man when you need him to harvest your grain, eh? He winks, but there's no real humour in it. Just a grim understanding of the new, brutal chess game being played across the country. That night, you lie awake, listening to the wind rattle your shutters. The house feels less secure now, less like a shelter and more like a target. Because that's the thing about progress. It always makes someone angry. And those angry people usually have swords and a lot of laws on their side. Next morning brings frost and bad news. Lord Edmund's steward shows up at your door before sunrise, his face grim as winter soil. His lordship wants to see you, now. The urgency in his voice is unmistakable. The walk to the manor feels different this time, longer, more ominous. The stones under your feet seem to whisper warnings, and your breath comes out in sharp puffs that disappear too quickly in the cold air. Lord Edmund's waiting in the great hall, but he's not alone. Two men in the king's colours stand beside him, their swords hanging heavy at their sides. Royal commissioners, sent to make sure the new law gets followed. They look bored, authoritative, and utterly disconnected from the realities of village life. They probably slept on silk sheets last night. Thomas, Lord Edmund says, his voice carefully neutral, almost apologetic. I'm afraid we need to renegotiate our arrangement. One of the commissioners steps forward. He's young, maybe 25, with the kind of soft hands that have never held a plough. He probably thinks a peasant's life is all quaint little cottages and singing while you harvest. By order of King Edward, he announces, his voice crisp and official, all wages are hereby returned to their levels of 1346. 2 shillings per week, no more. Your heart pounds, but you keep your voice steady. You've learned a thing or two about standing your ground. And if I refuse... The commissioner's hand moves to his sword hilt. Then you'll find yourself explaining your refusal to the king's justice. We have stocks set up in the village square, and brands heating in the forge. He means it. You look at Lord Edmund, searching his face for some sign of support, some flicker of the desperation you saw just months ago. But he won't meet your eyes. Whatever power you thought you had, it's gone. Just like that. The iron fist of the crown has come down. I understand, you say finally, because what else can you say? You're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outsworded. But as you walk back through the village, you notice something. The other peasants are gathered around the well, voices low but urgent. Margaret's there too, along with several farmers from neighbouring villages. Word travels fast, especially bad news. And resistance, it turns out, travels even faster. They can't just take it back, someone's saying, voice trembling with anger. We're the ones doing the work. We're the ones they need, king or no king, adds another voice, firmer. Dead men can't plant grain. You join the circle, feeling the tension crackling like lightning before a storm. These are people who've tasted freedom, tasted dignity, and they're not eager to give it up. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about what they know they're worth. What are you thinking? You ask. Margaret speaks up, her voice carrying an edge you've never heard before, cold and sharp. We're thinking maybe it's time the king learned who really keeps this country running. That afternoon, you're working your fields, your heart still heavy with the king's decree, when you see the smoke, 3 distinct columns of it, rising from the direction of Great Wickham, then more from Little Thornton and Wickfield. By evening, the horizon is dotted with angry orange glows against the darkening sky. Granaries, tax records, manor house outbuildings. Nothing that would actually hurt anyone. No houses where people lived, but everything that would send a very clear, very smoky message. The revolution has begun, or at least the extremely polite property damage only phase of the revolution has begun. It starts small, like most revolutions do. A tax collector here, a royal commissioner there, finding themselves suddenly unwelcome in villages where they used to command respect. Sometimes it's just cold shoulders and empty houses. Sometimes it's stones thrown from behind hedges, little plunks of defiance. But by winter, it's spreading like wildfire. You hear stories from travelling merchants, when any merchants are brave enough to travel, that is. Peasants in Kent marching on royal castles. Workers in Essex refusing to harvest grain for lords who won't pay fair wages. Entire villages in Yorkshire simply disappearing. People packing up everything they own and moving to places where they can get better treatment. And the amazing thing, the lords can't stop them. Because stopping a few troublemakers is one thing. Stopping half your remaining workforce is economic suicide. The king's laws are strong, but empty stomachs and empty fields are stronger. Lord Edmund tries threats first, then bargaining, then something that would have been unthinkable before, begging. Look, he says, during another awkward meeting in the Great Hall, his voice tinged with desperation. I know the commissioners said 2 shillings, but what if we called it 2 shillings plus expenses, food allowances, extra grain rations? You pretend to consider this, though really, you're just enjoying watching a lord squirm. This is a game of chicken, and he's losing his nerve. What kind of food allowances? Well, meat twice a week, good bread, ale with dinner, and housing. You can keep the house you're in now, no rent. It's not everything you had before, but it's something, and more importantly, it proves that laws are just words on parchment when reality doesn't cooperate. When a lord's entire livelihood depends on you, suddenly the king's law starts to look a lot less intimidating. You shake his hand again, and this time his grip is desperate, clammy. He knows he's been beaten. Winter settles over the village like a heavy blanket, but it's a restless kind of quiet. Letters arrive at the manor with increasing frequency, carried by nervous messengers who don't stay long. Reports from other parts of the kingdom, most of them bad news for anyone wearing a crown. The thing is, when you kill half the population, you don't just lose workers, you lose the social fabric that held everything together. The unquestioned authority, the ancient assumptions about who belongs where. And once people start questioning those assumptions, well, it's hard to get them to stop. It's like trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube after a very large, very angry giant squeezed it. Spring brings news of larger uprisings, not just local disputes over wages, but organized rebellions with leaders and demands and actual armies. Peasants who've decided they're tired of being peasants. The name everyone's talking about is Wat Tyler, a man from Kent who's apparently decided that the king's commissioners can go to hell, along with the king himself. They say he's got 10,000 men, Margaret tells you, her eyes wide as you help repair her roof. All of them armed, all of them angry. You hammer another nail into the thatch, thinking about how different everything feels now. Before the plague, 10,000 angry peasants would have been impossible. There wouldn't have been enough discontent, or enough confidence, or enough organizational ability. But after the plague, well, surviving a catastrophe teaches you that the impossible happens all the time. What's he want? You ask. End to serfdom, fair wages for all workers, death to corrupt officials. She pauses, then adds quietly, sounds reasonable to me. For a woman who was a peasant's wife a few years ago, this is radical talk. But everyone's a radical now. By early summer, the rebellion's no longer just a story you hear from travellers. It's something you can see on the horizon. Smoke from burning tax offices, streams of refugees fleeing areas where royal armies and peasant militias are fighting running battles. And then, one morning in June, you wake up to find armed men camped in your village square. Not royal soldiers, not exactly. And not local peasants either. Something in between. Men with weathered faces and work-hardened hands, but carrying proper weapons and wearing bits of armour, clearly taken from somewhere else. They look disciplined, determined, and very, very tired. Their leader approaches, a woman, which is shocking enough by itself in this patriarchal world. But she carries herself like someone used to being obeyed. And when she speaks, people listen. We're heading to London, she announces to the growing crowd, to present our demands to the king. Anyone who wants to come, you're welcome. What demands? Someone calls out from the crowd. She unfolds a piece of parchment, though you suspect she's memorized every word. End serfdom and villanage. Fair wages for all workers, abolition of poll taxes, punishment for corrupt officials who've grown fat while honest people starve. The crowd murmurs, weighing the risks, because joining a rebellion is serious business. People get hanged for rebellion, but then again, people have been getting hanged just for asking for fair wages. What's the real difference? What makes you think the king will listen? Lord Edmund has appeared, flanked by his remaining guards, but his voice lacks its old authority. He sounds worried, almost pleading. The woman looks at him with something that might be pity. Your lordship, with respect, the king doesn't have much choice. Half his tax collectors are dead or fled. His armies are stretched thin, fighting uprisings from here to Scotland. And winter's coming. If he wants grain harvested, and bread baked, and roads maintained, he needs us more than we need him. She's right, and everyone knows it. The silence after her words is deafening, filled only with the buzzing of flies and the nervous shuffling of feet. That evening, as the rebels make camp in the common pasture, you find yourself thinking about choices, about the life you've built since the plague, this newfound freedom and dignity, and whether it's worth risking it all for the chance at something even better, something that might benefit not just you, but everyone. Margaret's already decided. She sold her business to a cousin, packed everything she owns into a wagon, and volunteered to help organise supplies for the march to London. You coming? She asks as you help load her belongings. You look around the village, at the house you've called home, at the fields you've been working, at the life you've slowly, carefully constructed from the ruins of the old world. It's a good life, better than anything your parents could have imagined. But it's also a life that depends on the goodwill of people who would take it away in a heartbeat if they could. Yeah, you say finally, I'm coming. Because here's what you've learned in the years since the plague. Survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about building something worth staying alive for. The next morning, you lock your door, leaving a defiant note for Lord Edmund, explaining that you've gone to discuss working conditions with the king, and you join the long, winding line of people heading south toward London. The roads are full of others like you, farmers and craftsmen and merchants and labourers, all united by the simple belief that they deserve better than what they're getting. Some carry rusty old weapons, others just carry tools, but all of them carry something that would have been impossible before the plague: hope, a dangerous, intoxicating hope. The landscape you pass through tells the story of the last 5 years in burned fields and empty villages and manor houses with boarded windows. But it also tells another story, in new construction and improved roads and signs of careful, purposeful rebuilding. Because that's the thing about catastrophes. They clear away the old, making room for something new to grow. Sometimes, the only way to build a shiny new future is to clear a lot of debris first. As you walk, you talk with your fellow travellers. A blacksmith from Essex, whose lord tried to cut his wages in half. A miller from Suffolk, whose grain stores were seized by royal tax collectors. A weaver from Norfolk, whose entire village was burned for refusing to pay a poll tax they couldn't afford. All of them with stories, all of them with grievances, all of them with the same grim realization that individual resistance isn't enough anymore. By the third day, your group has grown to nearly 1,000 people. By the fifth day, there are rumours of other groups converging on London from all directions. Tens of thousands of people, all with the same destination and the same demands. The king's going to have to listen, whether he wants to or not. You camp that night on a hilltop overlooking the Thames. In the distance, you can see the smoke and lights of London, the largest city in England. And tomorrow, the site of what might be the most important conversation in the kingdom's history. As you settle into your bedroll, listening to the murmur of conversations around the campfire, you think about how far you've come, not just in miles, but in everything else. 5 years ago, you were a serf who couldn't leave your lord's land without permission. Tonight, you're a free man, camped outside the capital, preparing to negotiate with the king as an equal. That's worth something, even if tomorrow goes badly. The stars overhead are the same ones that shone down on the plague years, when bodies filled the streets and the future seemed impossible. But somehow, impossibly, the future arrived anyway, and it looks nothing like what anyone expected. London hits you like a slap to the face. The smell reaches you first, long before you see the city walls. Thousands of people packed together, cooking fires, human waste, horses, unwashed bodies, and underneath it all, something else. Something that makes your stomach clench with memory, fear, or maybe just the smell of too many unbathed people. You crest the final hill on June 13th, and there it is, the greatest city in England, spread out below you like a sprawling beast. Stone walls, dozens of church spires reaching for the heavens, the Tower of London looming over the Thames like a giant's angry fist, and surrounding it all, camps, thousands upon thousands of people, just like you, peasants and craftsmen and labourers who've walked hundreds of miles to have a conversation with a king. Jesus, breathes the blacksmith walking beside you. Look at them all. The camps stretch for miles along the river. Banners flutter in the morning breeze, most of them homemade, bearing symbols you recognise from your own village. The cross of St. George, tools of various trades, and here and there more ominous signs, nooses, headless crowns, slogans painted on rough cloth, death to traitors, and the classic, profoundly subversive cry, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. Your group finds space on a hillside called Blackheath, where the Kent rebels have gathered under their fiery leader, Wat Tyler. He's smaller than you expected, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of weathered face that speaks of hard work and harder decisions. But when he talks, everyone listens. His voice carries across the camp without strain. "Brothers," he says, his voice a gravelly roar, "tomorrow we enter the city, not as conquerors, but as free men seeking justice from our king." Cheers rise from the crowd, a tidal wave of sound, but Tyler raises his hand for quiet. "Remember, we're not here to destroy. We're here to build, to tear down the corrupt system that's kept us in chains, and replace it with something fair, something human." You find yourself nodding along, caught up in the hope and energy of the moment. Around you, faces shine with something that's been missing from English villages for too long: possibility. That night, you barely sleep. The excitement is infectious, crackling through the camp like lightning. People share food, stories, dreams of what comes next. A miller from Canterbury talks about starting a cooperative where workers share the profits. A weaver from Dover imagines guilds run by craftsmen instead of wealthy merchants. But underneath the hope, there's a wire-tight tension, because everyone knows that what happens in the next few days will determine whether this ends in triumph or massacre. Dawn breaks grey and misty over the Thames, and with it comes movement. Thousands of people breaking camp, gathering belongings, forming loose columns that stretch back toward the horizon. The march to London begins. You walk with Margaret and the blacksmith, part of a river of humanity flowing toward the city gates. The guards at Aldgate take one look at the approaching crowd and simply step aside. Smart men. You can practically hear them thinking, "Nah, not my problem." London's streets are narrow, twisting, designed for maybe a few hundred people at a time, not several thousand. The crowd spreads out like water, finding its level, filling every available space. And the city responds. Some Londoners slam their shutters and bar their doors, peering nervously through cracks. Others lean out of windows, cheering, throwing scraps of bread, and a few paltry coins. A few brave or foolish souls actually join the march. Craftsmen and labourers who've been nursing their own grievances against the wealthy merchants who run the city. But it's when you reach the wealthy quarter that things get interesting. The houses here are different, larger, built of stone instead of timber, with walled courtyards and/or manicured gardens. All the signs of lives lived in comfort while others struggled. Someone throws a stone, you're not sure who, but suddenly the air is full of them. Windows shatter, doors splinter, and the crowd tastes blood. The polite, property damage only phase of the revolution is officially over. The Savoy Palace, that's where it really starts. John of Gaunt's residence, the most magnificent private building in London after the royal palaces. Home to the man who's been the real power behind the throne. While young King Richard grows into his crown, he's hated, thoroughly and passionately. Someone shouts, "Burn it!" And suddenly, everyone's shouting it. You find yourself swept along with the crowd, through the palace gates, into courtyards filled with treasures that represent more wealth than your entire village sees in a decade. Tapestries, gold plate, furniture carved from exotic woods. And all of it, every bit of it, bought with money squeezed from people who work for a living. The palace burns beautifully. You stand in the courtyard, watching flames lick at windows, feeling the intense heat on your face, and thinking about justice, about balance, about how sometimes the only way to build something new is to burn down what came before. Margaret appears beside you, her face lit by the orange glow, reflecting the flickering flames. "Feel good?" she asks. "Yeah," you admit. "It does." But even as the palace burns, Tyler's trying to maintain order. You see him moving through the crowd, his voice hoarse, reminding people that they're here for justice, not revenge. That destroying property is one thing, but harming people is another. Mostly, people listen to him. Mostly, the Fleet prison gets opened, and suddenly, the streets are full of freed prisoners. Some of them are debtors, people imprisoned for owing money they couldn't pay. Others have been locked up for more serious crimes. And now, they're just another unpredictable element in this chaotic mix. Temple Bar burns next, along with all the legal records stored there. Centuries of laws and precedents and property deeds, gone in an afternoon of smoke and celebration. Because here's what the lawyers and lawmakers never understood. When the law serves only the wealthy, burning the law starts to feel like justice. It feels like setting yourself free. As evening falls, you find yourself with a group of rebels surrounding the Tower of London, the ancient fortress that usually laughs at rebellion. Tonight, though, it's looking less like an impregnable stronghold and more like a very expensive, very awkward picnic spot. The sheer number of people here is mind-boggling. Tens of thousands of us, stretching as far as the eye can see, a roaring, angry sea of peasants, craftsmen, and disgruntled folk from every corner of England. The air vibrates with the collective hum of righteous indignation, and the distinct smell of wood smoke from all those burning legal documents. "They'll never let us in," someone mutters, looking up at the towering stone walls. "They don't have a choice," Margaret says, her voice grim but resolute. She's got a smudge of ash on her cheek from the Savoy Palace bonfire, making her look surprisingly fierce. They need us more than they need those walls. And she's right. The guards on the battlements look pale, outnumbered 1,000 to 1. They're probably thinking, my pay isn't nearly enough for this. Suddenly, a cheer erupts. A small boat, rowed by a single, terrified guard, drifts from the tower moat to the riverbank. On board is the Lord Chancellor, Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Robert Hales, the Lord High Treasurer. They've been sent by the boy king, Richard II, who's holed up inside. They look like two very well-dressed pigeons, about to be introduced to a particularly hungry cat. "What do you want?" Sudbury quavers, his voice reedy against the roar of the crowd. He looks like he's about to faint, and frankly, who can blame him? "Justice!" the crowd bellows back. "An end to serfdom, fair wages, no more taxes." Sudbury starts to bluster. The king cannot possibly. But he's cut off by a chorus of boos. Wat Tyler, ever the pragmatist, steps forward. "Tell your king we demand to speak with him, outside these walls, where he can see the face of his people." The archbishop looks like he's going to swallow his own tongue. He fears for his safety. "Tell him," Tyler says, his voice dangerously quiet, "that his people are far more afraid of starving. Tell him he speaks with us, or we come for him." The two lords scramble back into their boat, looking like they've just had a very unpleasant conversation with a very large, angry dragon. We watch them go, the tension ratcheting up another notch. Everyone knows this is it. Either the king comes out, or we go in. And then, impossibly, the gates begin to creak open. Slowly, grudgingly, but they open. A hush falls over the crowd, quickly replaced by a collective gasp of disbelief, then a triumphant roar. The king, surrounded by his terrified retinue, is coming out. He looks like a tiny, jewel-encrusted deer caught in the headlights of a very large, very angry cart. King Richard II, a mere 14 years old, is escorted to a field just outside the city gates, a place called Mile End. He's perched on a horse, looking utterly bewildered, his glittering robes suddenly seeming very flimsy, in the face of tens of thousands of angry, armed peasants. It's a spectacle of epic proportions. Wat Tyler steps forward, surrounded by other leaders, including a particularly loud priest named John Ball, who's been preaching sermons about equality that would make the archbishop choke on his holy water. "My Lord King," Tyler calls out, his voice strong and clear, "we are your loyal subjects, come to make our grievances known." Richard, to his credit, doesn't immediately bolt. He raises a hand, his young voice surprisingly steady. "Tell me your demands. I will grant you all that is reasonable." A murmur ripples through the crowd. This is it. This is the moment. Tyler begins, listing them one by one, each demand a hammer blow against the old order. First, the abolition of all serfdom and villanage. All men are to be free. A massive cheer erupts, shaking the ground. Second, a fair wage for all labour. No more forced maximums. Another cheer, even louder. Third, the abolition of all poll taxes. They starve our families. A furious roar of agreement. Fourth, the right to buy and sell our goods freely in all markets. This one's for the merchants and craftsmen, and they roar their approval. And fifth, Tyler concludes, amnesty for all who have joined this revolt. Because, you know, it'd be a shame to go through all this trouble just to get hanged. Richard looks around, his eyes wide with fear and desperation. He sees the burning buildings, the angry faces, the sheer, overwhelming numbers. He knows he has no army here to stop them. "It is done," he proclaims, his voice ringing with forced authority. "All your demands are granted. You shall have charters of freedom for all. Return to your homes, and let there be peace." The crowd erupts, cheers, shouts, a joyous, almost disbelieving sound. People are weeping, embracing. It's over. We won. Or so we think. We, the common folk, accustomed to being lied to, still had a flicker of hope. And a young king, accustomed to having his way, had just performed the most stunning act of political theatre of his life. But as the main body of the rebels starts to disperse, satisfied with the king's promises, a smaller, more radical group remains. You and Margaret are among them. You've got a bad feeling. Promises are cheap, and the king is still surrounded by his cronies. "What about those inside the tower?" someone shouts. "The archbishop. Hales, they're the ones who enforce the taxes." Tyler, perhaps sensing the fragility of the king's promises, or perhaps simply caught up in the fury, gives a nod. "They will answer for their crimes." And just like that, the gates of the tower swing open again. No guards resisting this time. They're terrified. The rebels surge in, a wave of shouting, determined people. It's pure chaos. You're swept along, pushed through the narrow passages, the shouts echoing off the stone walls. We find Archbishop Simon Sudbury and Lord Treasurer Robert Hales cowering in the chapel. They look like they've seen a ghost, or perhaps seen their futures. No mercy is given. They are dragged out, crying for confession, and executed on Tower Hill. Their heads are then gruesomely paraded on poles. It's a terrifying, visceral act of revenge. A clear message. The old rules are dead, and so are their enforcers. The next day, June 15th, things are supposed to be calmer. The charters are being drawn up, supposedly, granting freedom and rights. But a new meeting is called, this time at Smithfield, a wide, open space outside the city walls. King Richard is there again, but this time with a larger retinue of knights, including the fiercely loyal Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth. Tyler and his remaining key leaders are there too, still armed, still wary. You're in the crowd, watching, your stomach a knot of apprehension. Tyler approaches the king, his manner confident, almost insolent. He probably feels invincible. He even takes a drink from a cup, perhaps to show he fears no poison. But his confidence is seen as disrespect by the king's men. "I have made promises," King Richard says, "and I will keep them. But you, Tyler, you grow too bold." Tyler, perhaps a bit drunk on power or actual ale, starts laying out new demands. He wants the abolition of all bishops, the confiscation of church property, the removal of all laws except the simple law of God. This is far beyond what was agreed at Mile End. He's pushing. Hard. Suddenly, Walworth, the Lord Mayor, can't take it anymore. He draws his sword. "You villain! You traitor! You shall not speak to the king in such a manner." In a flash, Walworth plunges his sword into Tyler's neck. Tyler falls from his horse, mortally wounded. The crowd gasps. Chaos erupts. The rebels, leaderless, begin to surge forward, swords drawn, bows knocked. This is it. This is where it all goes wrong. this is where the slaughter begins. But then, an astonishing thing happens. Young King Richard, barely a man, rides forward, directly into the furious, bewildered peasant army. No guards, no counsellors, just him and his horse. "Sirs," he cries out, his voice clear and ringing, "will you slay your king? I will be your captain. Follow me. I will grant all you desire." It's an act of incredible, breathtaking bravery, or perhaps pure, unadulterated desperation. He gallops to a nearby field, followed by thousands of dumbfounded rebels. While they're still trying to process what just happened, Walworth and his men, reinforced by loyal Londoners, fall upon the leaderless rebels left at Smithfield, brutally suppressing them. The uprising, in that single, decisive moment, is effectively decapitated. The days that follow are grim. King Richard, having shown surprising courage in the face of rebellion, now shows equally surprising cruelty in its aftermath. The promises made at Mile End are swiftly broken. The charters of freedom are revoked. The statute of labourers is reinstated, with even harsher penalties. Royal armies sweep through the countryside, hunting down rebels, punishing villages, and making examples of anyone who dared to question the king's authority. You manage to escape London, along with Margaret and a few others from Little Wickham. We ride hard, avoiding the main roads, sleeping in ditches, and relying on the kindness or fear of sympathetic villagers. The journey back is a blur of fear and despair. The brief, intoxicating taste of freedom has been replaced by the bitter ashes of defeat. When you finally return to Little Wickham, the silence is even heavier than before. Lord Edmund, looking shaken but relieved, immediately informs you that your wages are back to 2 shillings, and your Sunday afternoons off are, shall we say, flexible. The royal commissioners arrive a few weeks later, demanding names, imposing fines, and making sure everyone knows who's really in charge. You keep your head down, work your fields, and try to forget the taste of power. Many are not so lucky. John Ball, the rebellious priest, is captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. His head, like Tyler's, is impaled on London Bridge. Thousands of others are executed across the country. The official line is that the peasants were manipulated by evil men, but everyone knows the truth. They were driven by genuine grievances, by a hunger for dignity, and by the sudden, terrifying realization that the world had changed. But here's the genuinely ironic and somewhat darkly humorous part of this whole brutal affair. Despite the brutal suppression, despite the broken promises, something fundamental had shifted. The genie was out of the bottle, and no amount of royal decree or mass execution could put it back in. The king and his nobles could pass all the laws they wanted, but dead men still couldn't plant grain. The labour shortage was a very real, very stubborn fact. Lords still needed workers, and workers, despite the risks, knew their value. It became an endless, grinding war of attrition between desperate landlords and increasingly savvy peasants. Landlords, facing empty fields and crumbling manors, found themselves having to offer better terms, higher wages, and shorter labour duties, even if they did so grudgingly, and always with an eye on the king's commissioners. They offered longer leases, gave up rent for labour, and eventually many were forced to convert traditional serfdom into more modern tenant farming, where peasants paid rent but were otherwise free. The very foundations of serfdom began to crumble, not with a bang, but with the quiet, persistent grumble of empty stomachs and fallow fields. The echoes of the Black Death and the peasants' revolt stretched far beyond the fields of England. Across Europe, the same demographic pressures led to similar upheavals. In France, the Jacquerie Revolt broke out in 1358, another furious peasant uprising, brutally crushed, but again a symptom of the same underlying societal fractures. In Italy, urban workers in cities like Florence revolted, demanding better conditions. The old order, built on cheap labour and rigid hierarchy, was cracking under the immense pressure of population loss. This sudden scarcity of labour had profound effects on technology too. If you can't get 20 peasants to do a job, you better invent a machine that can do it with 5. This pressure indirectly spurred innovation, from improvements in farming tools to the eventual development of more complex machinery. It wasn't just about survival, it was about efficiency. Who knew mass death could be such a motivator for progress? The church, too, felt the immense pressure. With so many priests dying, less educated men were rushed into holy orders, leading to calls for reform and greater spiritual depth. The authority of the Pope and the Church was questioned more openly, laying some of the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation centuries later. When literally half the population dies, you start asking some pretty big questions about God and the people who claim to speak for him. Culturally, the Black Death left an indelible mark. Art became darker, more focused on death and suffering. Think skeletons dancing with kings in Danses Macabre. Literature reflected the despair, but also the resilience. Yet, paradoxically, with fewer people and more resources, the standard of living for the survivors generally improved. People ate better, lived in bigger homes, and had more disposable income, leading to new demands for goods and services. It was a boom and bust cycle on a truly epic, catastrophic scale. The nobility, faced with declining rents and rising labour costs, tried everything. New laws, military suppression, even marriage alliances to consolidate their dwindling land holdings. But they were fighting against an economic tide that was simply too strong. The shift from serfdom to tenant farming, and eventually to wage labour, was slow, messy, and often violent. But it was irreversible. And so, the story of the Black Death isn't just a tale of disease and death. It's a story of unexpected freedom, of power shifting from the privileged few to the desperate many. It's a hilarious, horrifying, and utterly fascinating testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the sheer unpredictability of history. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, when society seems to be crumbling, profound, often surprising, opportunities can emerge. So, the next time you complain about your boss, or the price of groceries, or the fact that you have to make your own bread, spare a thought for Thomas from Little Wickham. He survived the plague, faced down a king, and probably ended up with better working conditions than most of us. And he did it all because half the population died. Chew on that for a bit. And with that, our journey through the rather pungent, strangely hopeful aftermath of the Black Death comes to a close. Let the quiet rhythm of your own, blessedly plague-free, modern life settle around you. The fields are ploughed, the king has been, briefly, put in his place, and the future, though uncertain, is full of possibilities. Good night, and may your sleep be long, peaceful, and utterly devoid of medieval peasant revolts.